Welcome everyone to the Adversity to Advantage podcast. Today, after much back and forth, I've got a dear friend, or an old friend rather, I should say, named Ed Moss. And we were just reminiscing before we started recording about how we even knew each other. And it was, almost a decade ago, working with a youth charity, and our paths crossed on certain programs. And I was reminiscing about one of the toughest years of my life, really, but behind the scenes of all the good, exciting work that we were doing. Ed, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks.
It's really nice to be on the show. I've watched so many of the YouTube and podcasts as well.
Yay, that's so good. And I know, and I can see your background, I'm aware that you live on a boat and you just live in a slightly alternative way where you move around a little bit. Tell us about that. What's that like?
Yeah, so I live on a narrow boat, and I've been living on the boat for nearly 7 years now, 6.5 years. And originally it came out of deciding that I wanted my own space that was going to be mine. I'd kind of been homeless for a bit. I'd kind of lived in local authority housing and also shelters. And that kind of, there was a kind of, I just want my own space that someone can't take away from me. And I couldn't afford a house. And I decided to see like all of the upsides of living on a boat. So, I could live in Manchester, which is where I'm mostly based, but I can go on all these little adventures all over the place. It's just been a really interesting change of perspective. I always knew, I just kind of had this feeling when I moved onto the boat that like it would just fit how I saw life. So I didn't really have to change that much about myself, and it wasn't really kind of an expression of my identity. It just felt like it was going to be a place that could like facilitate me living how I kind of had dreamed of living.
I love that so much. I love it. And so just across your life, what are you passionate about at the moment? What do you do? What gets you excited?
Sure. So I spent a lot of time doing workshops as a freelance facilitator. I've been working this out for a long time, working for 3 years, trying all sorts of different stuff. Over time, I've kind of become much more comfortable with letting go of some things that maybe I'm good at but don't really enjoy doing, and kind of settled on working with people to kind of find their courage and different perspectives and different connections to kind of change something about a situation that organisation is in. So it's often like organisations, social enterprises mostly, that see how something's being done and go, this is ridiculous, or this is unfair, or this could be done better. And people often kind of get to that point and then really struggle with how to go through that change. And what I've realised over a number of years is that, one thing I can bring to that is some of my experience of going through that myself, and taking lots of organisations through that. And that's kind of why I kind of get up in the morning and sit down at the computer to try and pick up some of the stuff and plan some, interesting and visceral workshops to kind of really get people thinking about how they can play a role in the changes they want to see, and it to be less terrifying.
Less terrifying. I love that. And I can also see that some of the adversity that you've faced in your life very directly influences what you do or your purpose or how you give back in some way.
Completely. Yeah. It's funny, isn't it? Because you, well, I certainly have kind of a long background of always putting other people before myself. And one of the things that's been really interesting about becoming self-employed is you have to let go of that a little bit, and it's not becoming more selfish. It is definitely about looking at things in a more balanced way. I think when I was a bit younger, I kind of relied on some quite hardline rules to survive. So I kind of was a carer for my mum. She was not very well, and she was kind of she could be quite hot and cold. And I often find people who are very hot and cold quite difficult to be around.
It would trigger stuff up for you just from your own past, or that the emotional response of that.
Absolutely, and one of the things that has been really interesting for me is realizing that there is kind of lots of interesting patterns there, and one of the things is about So there was a process where I became homeless while doing my GCSEs.
Tell us about that. I would just want a little bit of surrounding information, like what got you to that point.
Yeah, sure. So so my mum was pretty ill. She then died of not the thing I was caring her for. She ended up getting cancer, to kind of add to the cocktail of stuff that was going on for her. So when she died, my dad just couldn't really deal with looking after me and my brother really at all. Just generational thing, his own experiences. He did the best he could in the situation, but it still led to some pretty poor behaviour. He could be quite violent at times, very controlling. And in the end, there was kind of a few instances where, I felt really, really fearful and threatened for my life. And one night, he just kind of lost it really during my GCSEs. And I kind of left. I did leave home in that instant. I ran out through the door and I never went back. And then there was a period of, sort of sofa surfing, and kind of, just having no fixed abode, bit of roughing. And so I think during that period, one of the things I've reflected on over the last couple of years is it was really hard to get to be listened to and to be heard. So the first thing that happened is when I went to the council to tell them what happened, they just rang my dad. And they said, "Oh, so we've got your son here, and so he's saying he can't come home." And my dad was like, "Well, he can come home."
Oh God! But so you're 16. You get so desperate that you've got to go to the council. You've got to figure something out. Were you able to be pretty direct and honest with them about being fearful and not being able to go home for those sorts of reasons?
At first, no.
Yeah.
I was kind of I was quite shy. I was quite embarrassed. I was quite shamed about what happened because I'd been the one that looked after everybody.
Yeah.
So I was also dealing with this whole kind of, oh my God, I've left my brother, and what are people going to think of me? All this kind of stuff. But I found out really quickly, like if you are not talking about the stuff that's really, really messed up, you just don't get listened to. And this is really interesting, is that you end up having to tell the worst parts of the story in a very kind of repetitive,
over and over,
quite damaging. Yeah, and one of the things that's really interesting, and I've done some work over the last few years, is kind of like remembering the other parts of the story, because when you have to repeatedly tell a negative story in order to access something as basic as housing or food, you just warp history really badly. And actually, there were times, even during that period, where my dad was, behaved really nice and really important to actually acknowledge that and go back and recognise it, because it wasn't all terrible all the time. So that's a really damaging way of telling a story, I think.
But that is super important for our listeners, because we can get stuck in the identity of the terrible, horrible thing that happened. Like I was raised in a cult, and it becomes the identity, and people's assumption is that it's all terrible and horrific and all this sort of thing. And actually, when you go back over the memory, you go, actually, my parents were really there for me, or there were amazing memories of me and my siblings traveling to amazing places that nobody had opportunity to, And so looking at it from the full spectrum of color rather than the black or white. I had a terror because I became homeless, or because my dad threatened me, and my mom passed away. Those headlines can then define you, and that's your identity, right?
Sure. And one thing I've been always, I think people have always sat up and taken notice of, is the fact that that's not been how the story has ever been told. And people often used to say, "Oh goodness, you're so brave and you're so courageous and you're really inspirational." And for a long time, I just didn't believe it at all. I kind of went, I was a bit like, I think I'd just taken for granted all the stuff that had come before that. Which was, and also there was another thing where I was so relieved to be out of that place, living in a bed and breakfast, where I was 16 and I was living with people who were out on remand for sex offences. It was a really badly placed placement.
That's horrific. Yeah,
being there was miles better than being at home for my well-being and mental health.
It was
Like,
better. So the context that you're describing was actually better than how it was
yeah,
at home.
I used to lock my door at night in that little hostel, and I had all my stuff. I mean, I didn't really have much stuff, but the stuff I had set up, and it was my space. And I was like, I just remember thinking, I'm free and I can just do stuff. I can make stuff happen. And it was
Oh,
because I had these amazing friends around me who I think were just mostly bewildered. um, a bit bewildered, and also were just really there for me, and absolutely would never ever ever let me, sink into, feeling like I was going to miss out on stuff.
so
Just because
is this sort
maybe
of school friends and kids your own age, or was it mentors, or
bit of a mixture. So there was definitely lots of. So these were mostly college friends at this time.
okay,
So I kind of carried on doing A levels. I started fresh. I went to college. I learned a really important thing about myself, which is that I can make friends really easily, and and to just trust in that, and that would be fine. Um, yeah, and so I kind of got through my A levels, but also I had at the time my girlfriend's mum, was very, very, very supportive, and we've kind of stayed in touch ever since, really. And she was really grounding in that way where, as you get further and further away from the weird stories, and you come to retell them, there's a moment sometimes for me where I'm like, God, that seems so long ago and so weird. Like, am I making it up?
mm. So
And she
questioning
will,
yourself.
right, yeah, and she's just really good at, like, just, she doesn't even tell me, no, you're not making it up. She'll just retell some of the experiences she had during that time,
Mm.
and I'm like, God, yeah, that was really, and I learned something different from it every time. Every time she retells it, and it's just really, I just find it really important to rehear that every so often. Not frequently, just every couple of years. We just, she'll come over and we'll have some wine and we'll just talk about. God, do you remember that time I lived on your sofa for 9 months?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Okay, so I mean, obviously, adversity, probably some rock bottom moments there, just as far
Yeah.
as your identity and thinking about your brother. And I mean, how did your relationship with your father evolve, or your connection to your family? Did you create distance, or what happened?
So we went through a few years of not really being that in touch. We had some really strange interactions with each other that were, um, you know, like, I think basically their method of dealing with it was to kind of go and, encourage the family to kind of back them up and support them. So I've not really had any contact with my biological family really since. There's, there's been a few interactions with them that were, I don't know what was going on really, but it wasn't appropriate at all. And actually, they always benefited directly out of each interaction. Um, so yeah, so in the end, actually, in about 2011, I remember having this conversation with my stepmom, and she'd rung me for something that she needed, having not spoken to her for months, if not a year. Um, and I remember she said to me, "When are you going to forgive us?" And I said to her, "That's really interesting because I don't think there's been anything to forgive." Which I might have changed my opinion on slightly now, but I was like, I don't think there's anything to forgive. But one thing I do think is important is that we've never had a chance to talk about what happened. Like, I've never had a chance to tell you how I felt and how let down I was by what happened. And I've never heard what it was like for you and Dad. I've got some assumptions about, how difficult things were, but I've never heard that stuff. And I think that would be a really important part of the healing process. I said, I'm really up for doing that. But you also need to recognise that I now have my own family. Like, I've made a family in Manchester, and they're really important to me, and they are there unconditionally. Like, that is really clear. There was no, oh, this is getting a bit difficult, we can't handle it, we'll run away. They are there unconditionally, and that's what I wanted, and that's what I needed, and that's what I have. So, of course, we can start again, but we're starting again as adults, as strangers, and we can build some kind of friendship. But I don't feel like I have I don't feel like I've got a space in my life. There's not a vacant gap of a parent. So you can't just kind of miss 10 years and just drop back in. So that's kind of how it would be. And she sort of said, well, I just don't think your dad will be able to have that conversation. And I said, well, not being funny, but, he's 70 something, he's retired and he's got plenty of cash. That really isn't my problem. And maybe he should go and deal with that. That's not my problem.
Take responsibility himself for
yeah.
his own processing of things. Yeah.
Of course. And I also said to her, but also, like, I get that it must be very sad, but also you and Dad seem to be very happy and seem to be having, a very nice life together. And, after all of those years of pain for my dad, I'm actually really pleased that, you've got that life. My brother's happy. He's doing what he seems to want to do. Like, you've all managed to get on. I'm happy. I'm doing what I want to do. I'd also question what your driver is about wanting to reconnect this stuff. Because, like, actually, it was really painful and it didn't work.
And can I just say, this whole conversation, your approach to it sounds very emotionally intelligent. It sounds mature. It doesn't sound vindictive, or all the things that we might be left with. What was the process that got you there, though? Like, how did you maybe work on yourself to get to this point where you could have that non-triggered, emotionally intelligent conversation or making those valid requests?
Sure. I think it definitely started, like, I saw things quite positively quite soon after leaving home. One of the ways I kept myself safe when I was homeless and also living in sheltered accommodation and local authority housing, where I was actually quite lonely and isolated, was to just kind of stay positive all the time. So every situation I was like, I would just instantly look for the positive, and I just trained myself to be as positive as possible. A friend of mine referred, when they first met me, said, goodness, I've never met anyone so pathologically positive.
And how do you think you developed that? I heard you earlier say being a carer and needing to make sure everyone was okay. Do you think it kind of derived from that childhood lesson?
Yeah, I think it's definitely come from that childhood lesson, and also I've got a kind of this pattern of generally putting other people before myself. And I think one of the things that teaches you is that you're constantly looking and reading and measuring what other people need and want, and therefore, and if you're working out how you can make them, if you're working out how you can fulfill some of those needs from a young age, like. And you're able to do that repetitively and frequently, like, I guess the message I was picking up a lot was like, oh, you can see a problem, and if you kind of just get into it for a bit, then you'll figure out a solution, and then things will be better.
So it becomes pretty hardwired.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it definitely. There were times where it faltered, and it wasn't, definitely always the right solution. But I think that was a big part of it. And also, when I was living at home and I was very, very depressed, and I'd sort of, I'd kind of gone quite actively into exploring what taking my own life would look like. And there was a few moments where in that process I just thought there's got to be another solution. Like, they just can't. This can't be the only option. And part of that was out of going, oh, what would my brother do? What would all these other people in my life do? I wouldn't want to do that to them. So I've got to find something.
So there was an upside in a way to thinking in that way. But as an adult, and in your own relationships and work life and all of that, has there been any downside to this thinking of other people first and this pathological positivity? Is there a downside?
Yeah, I think I've been getting used to the idea over the last year and a half, so it's still quite fresh for me. I had this realization when I was going through some therapy that I had a massive fear of sadness. Like, I was terrified of sadness. And I would do like ridiculous things possibly to kind of avoid sadness. So the kind of, like, I would be in a situation that was objectively sad, like it was a really sad situation to be in, and my first response would be, "Oh well, it's going to get better," and think about the positives that I could get out of that situation, and I would focus so quickly on improving myself to learn from whatever had just happened, that I just never really just accepted that some things are sad, and that they're not dangerous. Because when I was homeless and I had, and I was like, well, I'm kind of independent and I'm on my own, I couldn't afford to have a day off work. I couldn't afford to fall behind at college or anything like that. So I had to stay positive. There was no time for lazing around in bed feeling bad for myself, because I was like, because if I do, I am literally fucked.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say that here, but
you are yes.
There's literally nothing else, and then I'm in no better position than when I was in my bedroom, age 14, thinking, well, there's what's the point? So it kind of really got me through, and it drove me really hard, and I worked so hard. And that's that thing, is when you're really that positive, people are attracted to you professionally and personally, and it means that you can fulfill any of those needs really, really easily, while all the time never really working out what you want, and just suddenly finding yourself in this really interesting career where you're doing really well at it. But what you've also done is, because you've not really spent any time kind of being okay with the kind of sadder parts of stuff, is there's definitely this really interesting safety I found in kind of having a status. So being in a relationship, I felt safe just in a relationship. I felt safe having a job title.
Mm-hmm.
I felt safe. The day I signed that lease for my first kind of council property, where it was basically, so long as you keep paying the rent, you can stay here forever. All of those statuses were so important to me. And one of the things I've learned sort of through my 20s and now into my 30s is kind of going, okay, that was really important then. But you don't have to keep holding on to that stuff. You can let go of it now. You can be safe without those things.
You can make conscious choices. Yeah. And we talked a little bit before, and you referred to getting to a breakdown point. And I'm curious about that. Do you was that sort of a follow-on from all of this? Let me hold this all up positively, perfectly for so many people and stay safe in my status. And at some point, there was a straw that broke the camel's back, or what was that? Because I really want people to get the downside of, because on the outside it would be like, hey, what's wrong with that? It drove you, you achieved, you're a positive person. Positive psychologist would be winning. You're the guy who can translate everything into good, and I'm just curious, that led you somewhere. Tell us about that.
So that led me to eventually becoming chief exec of a charity, age 28, I think. And being this is great. And this organization was so in line with my values and my purpose around helping people to be heard and making changes based on people's experiences. I was so into it. It was amazing. And there was this kind of, it was also kind of very convenient. There was kind of off the shelf identity almost. And then the trustees had a change in kind of direction. We got a new, because I was kind of holding the fort basically in kind of interim way, and kind of really enjoying the experience of working collaboratively with everybody. We got a new chief exec in who just had a very different style, and it jarred so much. I just felt ill a lot. I was being asked to do things that compromised how I saw the world. Fundamentally, it was not even limiting belief stuff. It was just, I just don't think the world should run like that, and I've seen evidence that it doesn't need to be, and therefore I don't believe you. I don't care for this way of doing things, and I just can't do it. So I ended up leaving that job and I just went straight into another job really quickly, different sector. And I was like, yeah, this is great. I can do this. This is fine. And then one thing I just found really quickly is because it lacks that purpose for me. So all of a sudden, the kind of the foundation that was always about putting other people first and always about helping other people to tell their stories, like I just wasn't getting every day. It was the first time in my life that wasn't happening. I didn't have the same, status necessarily with, the same title that had been so easy for me to just trot off. Oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm such and such. I do this and I work for this organisation. Isn't that great? Isn't it positive and wonderful what I'm doing with my life? And it unravelled really quickly. And I remember this afternoon, I'd sat at my desk and I was kind of doing something, whatever, on a computer, and everyone and I felt this tightness like building up all over me all through the day, and it'd been building for weeks. And everyone left because 5:01, everyone had gone. It was that kind of organisation, which was a nice breath of fresh air. People just went home at the end of the day. It was great. And I remember getting to, I remember the sort of door buzzer went as the last person went out, and being like, I need to go home. Yeah, I should definitely go home. I'm definitely fine. I'm definitely fine. Everything's fine. And I can remember telling myself, everything's fine. And, you just got to switch the lights off and put the dishwasher on, and then you can go home, and then I can go and do something positive. And I could feel like I was having this argument internally, and there was someone desperately like rattling a cot or something, wanting to get out. I don't know how to describe it. And I remember I got to the train station. It was a beautiful sunny day, and it just started to rise up again. And I was there trying to push it back, force it back down. Like, no, I am fine.
Yeah, I'll tell you how we feel. Yeah.
And I got onto this train, and it was really packed. And so I stood up in the aisle, and it came up again, and I couldn't stop it. It just overcame me, and I burst into tears on a packed commuter train. And I went and I couldn't stand up. So I ended up lying on the floor, and the funny thing was that people made space for me to lie on the floor, but then like nobody knew what to do. So I just lay on the floor and I sobbed all the way back to Manchester, which was about 25, 30 minutes or something. And I got up off the floor, and I did one thing that I'd never ever done in that situation before, which was ring who I referred to as my Manchester parents. And I just picked up the phone as I got off the train, and I didn't even have to say anything. And Jez, who's my Manchester mother, just said, just come over. And I remember coming over, and I didn't say anything at all. I just cried. I cried so much for, it felt like hours. And that was kind of the start, really, of going, right, I need to do something about this. And I don't need to find a positive solution for it. I just need to work out what this is.
And it doesn't.
Yeah, and I look back on it now, and I remember feeling like, how am I going to fix this? And one of the things that I really got out of the therapy process was some stuff. Like, I've been through a lot. I have been through a lot. And some of it is really sad. Like, it is really sad that I don't have a relationship with my biological family. But also looking at the likelihood and possibilities and combinations of things that could happen, that's not going to change in a way that is going to be good for me. So, like, that's okay. It would kind of be ridiculous to look at the catalogue of stuff that happens and say that there was no sadness in there. And I think that day on the train was kind of, it just all finally came out. And importantly, it came out because I was safe and ready for it to come out.
That's such a wise thing that I just want to capture for people. Because sometimes life is suddenly good, right? It's suddenly great, and then you can feel like you're falling apart. And it's very useful to note that doesn't mean you haven't worked really hard and gotten to where you need to be, and that you are, but it does mean that you're safe and that you're now giving yourself permission, or your body's giving yourself permission to, after all the buildup of grief and homelessness and fear and all of those things, to just let it out and release, and that can be really healthy, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And and just still working through like some of those things that have made me feel sad. And a friend of mine introduced me to Inside Out, the film.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know if you've seen it.
Yeah. It's like a cartoon,
so,
right? With all the little parts in your brain, the emotions, yeah.
Yeah, and there are 5 characters that play the different roles of the different emotions. Spoiler alert for anyone listening, like skip forward this bit, is that at the end, Happiness, who's like the main character, recognizes the value of sadness and how important sadness is. Now, I can't tell you how much I cried that evening. And my friend was like,
"It's just a cartoon." Yeah.
I was like, it just felt like one of those moments where I felt like, that someone else had expressed something that, like it just made it feel much more. God, if they made a film about this, loads of other people must have had this too.
So, like, embracing the full range of who you are. We don't need to shut off other sides of ourselves or forget that we had pain and only translate it into something positive. There's actually great strength and power in the vulnerability of embracing all sides of ourselves and being open about that, and making conscious decisions to process it, to take actions that are in line with our values, things like that.
Yeah, and one thing that's really interesting is, I think, so I often look back at some of the things and think, goodness, how did I get through that? And there was a kind of positivity that I kind of mentioned, and one of the things I find really interesting that I'm just kind of unpicking a bit is, so through being fearful of being sad or allowing myself to kind of sit with that sadness, there was a kind of almost like addiction to positivity, and I think going through, what am I trying to say? So the addiction to positivity, I think, meant that I never had to deal with sadness. You don't have to deal with sadness, then that's one of the biggest things I've always been fearful of, or made me feel really vulnerable. Like, I feel really vulnerable when I'm sad about something.
And I totally relate, because about 10 years ago, I was suicidal. I was in a point where I had a toddler and a baby, and I put them in dangerous situations. Alcohol addiction was really high. And I just remember, like, if I even talk about it, I remember the feeling of the absolute loneliness and isolation, and that nobody was going to help me, and, all this sort of stuff. And it was dangerous at that time. It was literally, my kids could be in danger, my life could end. Like, it was black or white dangerous. But like the hint of it now, of just like a little bit of downtime or a little bit of depression or tears, makes me go, fuck no, I'm going to drive harder, right? And so it's really, I always learn something from these podcasts, as people know. And it's really good to remind myself that, yes, it can be used as fuel as far as our purpose and helping others, which is a beautiful thing. Like, I don't want to discount that. And we need to listen to our bodies and our minds to actually know what it is that we need sometimes to slow down, to reflect on pain, sadness, and to connect maybe with the right people. What are the things you do now, or that you've learned along the way, that help you to look after yourself, think about your own mental health, that mechanism of a boundary, so that it's not giving all of your energy away, but keeping some for yourself? Like, what are the things, the kind of strategies that you've learned now?
Yeah, so I'm still working on boundaries.
It's a tricky one. Saying no.
Yeah, realizing that other people's emotions are not my responsibility.
It's a huge one once you figure that out, though.
So I'm at awareness now. So
yes, first step.
How I'm going to deal with that. The other thing I think, so one thing that's really changed for me in the last, so by going self-employed, is so changing this idea that you have to be seen to be busy from 9 to 5, and
or
once
longer.
you or more, once you can kind of once I found a process to let go of that, and I'm still not quite sure how I did that. Just other than through experimentation, was realizing that I could achieve the same level of income. So the first year I was like really harsh on myself. I pushed, even though I was like having a full-on meltdown, and I was kind of battling with myself and bullying myself into kind of continuing. And then, as I say, through the therapy process, I kind of started to carve out time. So just carving out time to go to therapy, and then literally not being able to do anything for the rest of the day, just because my head was like, I just had to start accepting that. And I was like, if you don't want to carry this stuff around with you all the time, you need to find some time to put the bag down. And I remember my therapist saying, what would it be like to put all of this down? And I just was like, that was too much. That question.
But then you realize how attached you are to everything, to the chasing the status or chasing the money or whatever it might be to help you feel like some self-worth.
And for me, it was never about money. It was, and the status I was saying was about creating safety for myself. For me, my self-worth only came from being able to provide or help other people. And if I didn't do that, I was worthless.
Like, what was your identity then? Like, who are you if you don't have those things? Right.
Absolutely. So actually the breakdown, and more recently, after I was attacked, things like that, the excruciating vulnerability I feel about asking other people in those situations to help me, because I can't give back. And it's not asking. So I can ask you for help, and I've become much more comfortable over the years. And one of the things I've realized is that I have to help a lot, going through things, and I've got much better at asking for help and offering it. I've always been happy to offer it. But the time that gets pushed to its limit is where I feel incapable of giving.
Of doing the nice trade to give back in some way.
Yeah, and actually the more recent experience, I had to keep reminding myself that with the attack, I just kept reminding myself that you give all the time, and just because you ask for people to help you in this situation, doesn't mean that they're going to use up that well straight, like within that amount. And also, if people can't give to you in that moment, it's not because of you; it's because they can't give in that moment for whatever reason. It's not personal.
So that's again, they're responsible for themselves.
Absolutely, and I think that's been really helpful. So that process of like my relationships with other people. So that moment where I picked up the phone and rang Jazz on that day was a huge moment. The other times since then where I've just gone, okay, fine. After my attack, some friends set up a crowdfunder. And raised some money to replace my phone, which my insurance company wouldn't replace, because I obviously use a phone for work a lot, and take lots of photos using my phone. It's a really important. I really enjoy it. I can't tell you how, like that. I was just like,
just receiving.
What now?
Yeah.
They've done what? And they're giving me how much? Oh my god. Yeah, and I found it really. At first, I could just feel that kind of like, no, I'm the one that gives. I'm the one that gives.
Wow. Yeah.
And I just really just eased off that. And I think one of the ways that I've been able to do that, again, because all these things are holistic, right? You don't, it's not like one silver magic bullet. It's a collection of different things that you're doing, plus everything you bring with you in your life. And so I've been going back to yoga.
Amazing.
A lot, and so in the past I went to Ashtanga yoga when I was living in Birmingham, and did it very religiously in that very kind of I'm going to be positive, everything's going to be great. The thing I loved about Ashtanga was that it was the same sequence every time, and it was about achieving certain postures. So at that time, it was perfect for me because I was like, that's what I wanted to be doing. You know, like perfection. Whereas the place I go to now has loads of different teachers. They all focus on something different. The classes are quite different from each other, and I go to the first class of the day. So sometimes that's at 7:30, sometimes it's at 10. But I always make sure that is the first thing I do. If I'm delivering a workshop, I'll give my permission to not go to it, because that sometimes doesn't work out practically. Sure. But if I'm not delivering, when I'm at home or if I'm working, like that is the first thing I do in the day. And I go make that time for me, because as well as being physical and reminding myself that I have this body that can move, I'm also reminding, like, I'm able to use that time to check in on how I'm feeling, and then process what I'm going to do with that. So if I wake up and I'm like, oh, actually, I'm feeling a bit sad today, what I used to do is, why are you feeling sad? What can we do to sort it out?
Fix it, change it.
Fix it. Yeah, right. Go for a run. That'll sort you out. Then you'll
get quite like a shouty bully voice, right? It's just like, fix yourself. Yeah.
Whereas now it's, I'll go to yoga and I'll lie down and they'll say, like before we start the class, and it's like, okay, so like check in with how you're feeling this morning. And I'm like, I'm a bit tired this morning. So I'm just going to take it easy in this class, and that's quite nice. Or if I'm like, I'm feeling a bit sad, I'm like, that's fine, that's okay. Like, this can be a sad day, and that's fine,
So that whole voice is self-compassion rather than shouty. Yeah.
And I had one a few weeks ago where I just, in that class, I was like, I'm feeling quite sad today. And I thought, by the end of the class, I hadn't spent much time thinking about it, but as I was kind of getting changed, the thing that felt right to do was to go back and to make a coffee, and to sit and read my book. And I just sat for about 45 minutes and read my book. And I did some like sketching and painting and stuff like that, for another 45 minutes. And my mood changed massively in that time. But because there was no pressure to be better, I could just sit and be with all that stuff. And I was safe. Like, I could be sad and it wasn't going to destroy me.
Oh my God, that's so powerful. That's so powerful that you can hold the duality of it, that I can acknowledge this feeling and I can do something self-compassionately that recognizes that it might be slowing down that I need, and doing something creative that isn't status-driven or achievement-driven, just to nurture yourself.
And the other important thing about those two things is, so I've never been that good at reading. I've always found it difficult. And by no means am I an accomplished, visual artist with a paintbrush. And I think there's something really, I'm finding something really important in not having to be good at something. So in those moments where I am feeling sad, like giving myself permission to go and do something or be, with something that I've traditionally not associated as being good at, I think is really, I've not worked out what that is yet, but like that seems to be a way that I can be with all of that stuff.
Amazing. Utilizing the creativity. Ed, we are coming to the end of our time. I feel like we could go on for another 3 hours. I feel like I'm going to have to get you on again, and we're just going to go deep on positive psychology or self-care as a self-employed entrepreneur, because that stuff is a struggle. We could do boundaries as well. Oh, there's so much we could do. But in order to close for today, what advice would you give to, I don't know, your 16-year-old self, or the kid who's just trying to survive and figure it out, or for people who are in a similar situation, who've dealt with grief and don't feel like they have a support network? What advice would you give to that guy?
So in that way that I don't think that whole thing of those paradoxes about going back in time, would you change the future? I wouldn't want to change anything, because all of that has got me here. But one thing I would want to say to myself at the time is, everything you're doing now is right for now. And I was talking to a friend recently, and we were talking about, some of the shameful things or the things you might feel shameful about that you do in a moment. But then you kind of forget about the context. And I was just like, yeah, but like it was right in the moment. You made the best, like we're hardwired to survive. And you made the best decisions that you possibly could have made with the information and the tools that you had available to you at the time. If you're in a relationship where there's like abuse or something, like you're not going to have the skills and tools to make the right decisions that you would do if you weren't in that relationship, right? But when you're in it in the moment, you make the best decisions with what you've got. So I just think, rather than going, oh, I could have handled that better and been perfect, it was like, why don't you just accept that that was what you could do at the time, and that you're no longer in that situation, you're no longer in that context, and of course you can look back on it and think you'd do something differently.
But that's with hindsight and with the skills that you have now.
Yeah, of course. And isn't that a beautiful gift to say that you've now got those things that you didn't have then? But it doesn't mean that you were shameful in that moment. And you'll look back on this time now in the future and think, goodness, if only I had something that you might gain in the future. I guess that ties into this idea of kind of being good enough. And I know you're a big fan of Brené Brown. And for years I used to watch her videos around vulnerability and shame, and be like, yeah, I understand what you're saying, I just don't get it. Like, right. I don't get it.
Yeah.
And then as I've gone on these journeys over the last sort of 3 or 4 years, I've watched those videos, and the percentage of personal experience that I feel when I watch those videos goes up and up and up every time. Because I'm like, oh, like it's not just an academic understanding of the concepts now. It's I've got an actual personal experience and I feel it, see it.
And it's the daily actions that we can take that show that are vulnerable, like this podcast, for example, or like connecting to our partners or the people that are in our life, and show like taking down the mask and being our real self, even if it's messy, even if it's not all figured out.
And it's interesting because you referred at the beginning to the kind of the toing and the throwing. And there was definitely a period when we first started this conversation about doing this podcast where I was like, I've got nothing to offer this. Like, I really don't have anything to offer it. And I was in a funny headspace because like there'd been another kind of attack just 6 weeks before it as well. I'd had a bit of a run of bad luck. And I was like, I'm just not in the right space for this. I've got nothing to offer. I would need to present myself in this kind of perfect way. And part of it was that my head was just all over the place, and you'd have just got garbage, I think. But also, like, even as late as Friday, I was thinking, I don't know, like, yeah. maybe I should cancel now, and then you can find somebody else to do this podcast. And I just thought, no, just like lean into it, and it doesn't need to be polished and perfect and finished.
And I have to say, I'm so happy you did. Like, I have a trust thing that when the time is right, the guests will just show up, And so I never feel like I pressure, like I want to go, no, but you don't cancel. Because I'm like, nope, because the universe knows the process that goes on within a person in order to put their story out on a public platform and for you to be ready for that level of vulnerability. I always do say, and I get these as well, vulnerability hangovers. So self-care over the next few hours or tomorrow, because I usually wake up and go, fuck, what did I say? And then I realize the impact. And I know from what I've heard that I just appreciate so much your vulnerability and you showing up, and that this is exactly what's going to sort of propel our audience to think about this in a different way. Because it's a different angle on just check your mindset and move forward. It's actually like breathe into where you actually are and audit it from that perspective of self-compassion and looking after yourself. Ed, if people want to connect with you in some way, where can they find you? And is it Instagram the best place? Where can people find you?
Well, if you're particularly interested in boat life and I do like taking photographs. So I'm on Instagram as @theboatelf. If you're interested in the kind of work that I'm doing, I'm on Twitter at edmossbtg, and I've got a website which people can have a look at if they wanted to, bridgingthegap.tips tips. And yeah, so like I'm always really interested and happy to hear from people. I once was on, I did a thing on radio for a couple of years ago where it was called Interviews on a Bench, and they just interview people in the park, and it was really lovely actually. I had a few people email me after that sort of interview and sort of say, oh my goodness, you know, this has really helped, or you know, I'm really curious to see what you think about this. And I find people asking me questions often is also really good to, you know, get to me thinking.
Absolutely.
So I find that really helpful too. But
amazing. Yeah, we'll add all of that into the show notes. Ed, thank you so much for your time. I can't wait for this to be out there.
It's going to be cool.
It is.
Cool. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.